February 24th, 2023 began as a carefully orchestrated plan built on deception and promises. Inside a suburban Virginia home, the pieces were already in motion. Brandon Banfield, a federal agent with the IRS, had spent months crafting an elaborate scheme designed to eliminate his wife Christine and make it appear entirely justified. At the center of this plan was Juliana Peres Magalhaes, the family's 22-year-old Brazilian au pair who had fallen deeply for Brandon and believed everything he told her. Christine Banfield had no idea what was waiting for her that morning. She was asleep in bed while her husband moved quietly through the house. He took her phone and disabled the door lock so it would not automatically secure itself. Then he turned off her phone and placed it in a kitchen drawer where she would never think to look for it. Every detail mattered. Every step followed the plan he had carefully laid out. Brandon had convinced Juliana that Christine needed to be removed from their lives. He wanted full custody of their young daughter Valerie and believed divorce was not an option. Money was also part of the equation. He spoke to Juliana about hiring someone to kill Christine, but worried it would trace back to him. So they developed a different approach. They would use Christine's email accounts to create a fake online profile and lure a stranger into the house. The stranger would be set up to take the blame. Brandon would play the hero, Christine would be dead, and no one would suspect the truth. The website they used was called FetLife, a platform for people interested in extreme and unconventional encounters. While Christine was home and unaware, Brandon and Juliana used her laptop and phone to send messages to various men. They were looking for someone willing to be aggressive, someone who would bring restraints and a knife, someone who would agree to come to the house without meeting Christine in person first. Brandon told Juliana that using Christine's devices while she was in the house was crucial. If investigators ever looked into it, the messages would appear to have come from Christine herself. After contacting several men, they connected with Joseph Ryan. The messages between Joseph and the fake profile using the name Anastasia encouraged a level of violence and suggested that some marks were acceptable as long as clothing could cover them. Joseph sent a photo of a knife. The plan was taking shape. On the morning of February 24th, everything moved according to schedule. Brandon woke early and finalized the arrangements with Joseph through Christine's phone while she slept upstairs. He confirmed Joseph would arrive at 7:20. Then he packed a fake outing to the zoo for Valerie. Juliana prepared a lunch and got the child ready. Brandon left the house first and drove to a nearby McDonald's. Juliana waited in the cul-de-sac with Valerie in the back seat and a gun in her pocket. Her role was to watch for Joseph and alert Brandon the moment he arrived. Joseph Ryan showed up exactly as planned. Juliana called Christine's phone first to create a record of a warning, even though the phone was turned off and hidden in the kitchen. Then she called Brandon to signal that Joseph had entered the house. Brandon left the McDonald's and drove straight home. He met Juliana outside, and together with Valerie, they re-entered through the basement. Brandon went upstairs first. Valerie stayed in the basement as instructed. A few minutes later, Juliana followed. When she reached the bedroom, Brandon yelled that he was a police officer. Christine's voice rang out in response. She shouted that someone had a knife. Brandon fired the first shot at Joseph. Christine was still alive. She told Juliana to call 911. Juliana dialed but hung up quickly. She later claimed Brandon gestured for her to end the call. The 911 center called back and left a message. Time passed. This was not part of the plan. Juliana said Brandon, then climbed on top of Christine and told Juliana to get a towel. She left the room and returned to see Brandon stabbing Christine with a knife. Juliana testified that she covered her ears and eyes but looked up several times and saw him continue. Then Brandon told her to go to the safe in the closet. When she came back, Joseph was moving. Juliana warned Brandon and then fired her gun. She shot Joseph Ryan. Brandon told her to call 911 again, this time for real. 15 minutes had passed since the first aborted call. The 911 recording captured Juliana's frantic voice saying her friend had been stabbed and was bleeding. Then Brandon took the phone. He identified himself as a federal agent and said he had shot an intruder who had stabbed his wife. He asked what to do. Christine had multiple wounds on her neck. The call sounded desperate and convincing. Police arrived and found Christine Banfield dead from stab wounds. Joseph Ryan was also dead from gunshot wounds. The scene appeared to support the story Brandon and Juliana were telling. An intruder had attacked Christine. Brandon had arrived in time to stop him. Juliana had assisted. Valerie had been in the basement the entire time. For months, the story held, but investigators kept digging. They examined the messages sent from Christine's accounts. They traced the timeline of the 911 calls. They looked at the relationship between Brandon and Juliana. It became clear that Brandon and Juliana had been involved romantically while Christine was still alive. The defense did not dispute this. They had been living together in the house for over a year. The affair was known. What raised deeper suspicion was what happened after Christine's death. Juliana did not leave the house. She moved directly into the bedroom with Brandon. She took Christine's place in every sense. They continued their relationship openly. When Juliana was arrested in October 2023, she was still living in the home as if nothing had changed. Brandon was not arrested until nearly a year later in September 2024. By that time, Juliana had spent months in custody. She had written letters to Brandon expressing her devotion. She said she could not live without him. She wrote that she would take the blame for both of them. She told his mother she would give her life for him and would never hurt him. Brandon's mother was paying for Juliana's defense attorney and funding her commissary account so she could communicate with family and buy extra food. Then something shifted. Juliana had a medical emergency and spent several days in the hospital. When she was released, she signed a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter for shooting Joseph Ryan. She agreed to cooperate with the prosecution against Brandon. The financial support from Brandon's family stopped immediately. At trial, Juliana became the star witness. She walked into the courtroom through a side door and past the defense table where Brandon sat. She looked different. Her hair was dark instead of blonde. She wore glasses. To use a he, she appeared smaller and more subdued. She took the stand and described the entire plot in detail. She said Brandon had convinced her that Christine needed to be eliminated. She said they used Christine's accounts to lure Joseph Ryan. She said Brandon killed Christine and she shot Joseph. The defense attacked her credibility. They questioned her memory. They pointed out that she could not recall many specific details about setting up the fake profile or the exact sequence of messages. Juliana often responded that she did not remember or that her brain had blocked out certain things as a defense mechanism. The defense argued that her memory was conveniently weak on crucial points. They also questioned her motives. They brought up the letters she had written to Brandon. They highlighted her dependence on his mother for financial support. They suggested she had taken the plea deal not because it was the truth, but because it was her best option. They noted that she had been in contact with media outlets and implied she might profit from the case. They mentioned that a producer from a national news program had reached out seeking an interview, though the network made clear it does not pay for access. The defense also challenged the entire catfishing story. They argued that detectives who disagreed with this theory had been transferred from the case. They suggested the investigation had been shaped to fit a narrative rather than following the evidence. But the prosecution had recordings of Juliana's statements and testimony from investigators who had built the case step by step. Brandon Banfield faced charges of aggravated murder for both Christine and Joseph Ryan. He also faced charges of felony child abuse and neglect and felony child cruelty related to Valerie being in the house during the violence. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense maintained that Joseph Ryan had attacked Christine and that Brandon had shot Joseph in self-defense. They argued that Juliana's testimony was unreliable and motivated by self-interest. The trial played out over several weeks in the same courthouse that had hosted the high-profile defamation case between two celebrities. The same judge presided. Cameras were allowed due to the intense public interest. The case was being called the Eau Pair affair by media outlets across the country. Every day, the courtroom filled with reporters and observers trying to understand how a plan this detailed and this cruel could have unfolded in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Juliana's testimony painted a picture of manipulation and control. She described how Brandon had slowly drawn her into the scheme. She was young, far from home, living in his house and in love with him. She said he convinced her that getting rid of Christine was the only way they could be together. She said he told her divorce was not an option and that hiring a hitman would be too risky. So they created a plan that would make everything look like self-defense. Joseph Ryan became the unwitting target. He responded to messages he believed were from a woman interested in extreme encounters. He brought a knife as requested. He showed up at the house at the agreed time. He had no idea he was walking into a trap designed to end his life and justify the murder of Christine Banfield. The prosecution argued that Brandon had orchestrated every detail. He controlled the timeline. He disabled the locks. He hid Christine's phone. He coordinated with Juliana to ensure Joseph arrived when Christine was vulnerable and alone. He positioned himself as the hero who arrived just in time. But the plan fell apart when Juliana called 911 too early. That mistake created a gap in the timeline that investigators eventually noticed. The defense fought back by emphasizing inconsistencies in Juliana's account and questioning whether she was telling the truth or simply trying to reduce her own sentence. They pointed out that she had initially stood by Brandon and only turned against him after spending months in jail and facing the possibility of life in prison. They argued that her cooperation deal gave her every reason to say whatever prosecutors wanted to hear. But the evidence kept pointing back to Brandon. The messages sent from Christine's accounts, the timing of the calls, the way the scene had been staged, the relationship between Brandon and Juliana that continued openly after Christine's death, the letters Juliana had written before deciding to cooperate. Everything suggested a plan that had been carefully constructed and nearly succeeded. The trial continued with additional witnesses and evidence. Investigators testified about the steps they took to uncover the truth. Forensic experts explained the wounds on Christine's body and the trajectory of the bullets that killed Joseph Ryan. The prosecution built a case that showed premeditation, manipulation, and cold calculation. For the families of Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan, the trial offered some measure of accountability but no real closure. Christine had been killed in her own home by the person she trusted most. Joseph Ryan had been lured to his death by a scheme designed to make him look like a violent criminal. Valerie had been in the house during the violence, an innocent child caught in the middle of a plan that treated human lives as obstacles to be removed. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the question was not whether something terrible had happened, but who was responsible and to what degree. Juliana had already pleaded guilty and agreed to testify. Brandon maintained his innocence. The jury would have to decide whether the evidence supported the prosecution's theory of a carefully planned double murder or the defense's claim of self-defense and unreliable testimony. The case exposed the dangers of unchecked manipulation and the devastating consequences of choices made in secret. It revealed how a relationship built on deception could spiral into violence, and it left a community grappling with the knowledge that behind the facade of a normal family, a plan had been unfolding that would end 2 lives and shatter many more.